Please welcome to the stage the Atlantic's Patrick Garrigan.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Wow, we are so delighted to be here and so delighted to see all of you. Thank you so much for building this into your day. We are overjoyed to have you here. And we were glad to be returning back to Minneapolis. This is our second time here in town this year for this very important event, Informed, the new era of local news. This evening, we'll explore what the future holds for one of the most important pillars of our democracy, the free press. As a personal side, growing up, my father was a local radio journalist, and whether it was watching him in the studio or seeing him on the street talking to folks in our small town of Marion, Ohio, I got this incredible appreciation for the responsibility that local journalists feel to their communities, and reciprocally the spirit that this work inspired within the community itself. Journalists have a critical role to play in our society, keeping citizens informed, shining a light on harmful corruption, and asking tough questions of our elected leaders. But many news organizations, especially local ones, are in a fight for their future. They're forced to develop new business strategies to stay in the black. They're battling the onslaught of misinformation from unreliable sources online, and often they're struggling to represent the entirety of our diversifying and complex communities. Tonight, we'll hear about all of these challenges, but more importantly, we'll talk with the local leaders who are coming up with solutions. Additionally, we've got a great group here in the audience. Again, we are delighted to have you all here. Just looking around, you are surrounded by local journalists, producers, show hosts, community leaders, professors, students, and so much more. So I encourage you, whether it's during kind of breaks in between sessions or at the reception afterwards, to take a moment and introduce yourself to the person next to you. You really are surrounded by incredible company. We're delighted to have you all here. Over the course of the next conversation, we will leave time for your questions. Additionally, we want you to participate in the conversation online. We are on Twitter using the handle @AtlanticLIVE and across all social channels using the platform #AtlanticInformed. Again, that's #AtlanticInformed. As I mentioned, we'll leave time at the end of this session and all the sessions. Incredibly important that we get your questions, so be sure to raise your hand up high and our team will bring a microphone over to you. So before I introduce our first conversation tonight, I want to take a moment to recognize Google News Initiative for supporting tonight's journalism. Additionally, I want to thank our partners, the Star Tribune, for their collaboration on this event. Let's take a moment to give them a quick round of applause. To that end, what better way to start an event on local news in Minneapolis than an interview with Mike Klingensmith. He is the publisher and CEO of the Star Tribune Media Company, which owns the largest newspaper in Minnesota. And here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Derek Thompson. Derek, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I typically do not just recite the resume of the person that I'm about to interview because that is often tedious. In this case, however, you have worked for essentially every single non-Atlantic magazine that I've ever subscribed to. So I do just want to name check some items from that past. Mike was president of Sports Illustrated, founding publisher of Entertainment Weekly, CFO and executive vice president of Time Inc., and then you retired.
Right.
And then you made a decision to become unretired in order to solve the seemingly untractable problem of local news. What were you thinking?
Yeah, call me crazy. I got a call from a headhunter at Spencer Stewart who was doing the search for the Star Tribune. I was happily retired, and he knew I worked with him at Fortune magazine, and he knew I was from Minneapolis. He called me and said, "I'll just take a shot. Would you have any interest?" And as I thought about it more and more, I thought, first of all, I was on the Star Tribune website every day in New York City from the time they had a website, so I was a customer. Secondly, I thought to myself, that could really be an interesting job. But third, it could be a really important job. And if we could make some progress working on the business model for newspapers in that market, that might influence other markets. And so I thought there wasn't anything that probably would be more interesting in a challenging way and important for me to do. So I had to talk my wife, who's from Southern California, into this idea. She still hasn't forgiven me, but anyway.
So I was looking at a Wall Street Journal report on the state of local news, and it said that after the Boston Globe, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune has the highest rate of digital convergence, or digital conversions. That is to say, the largest share of people who read the Minneapolis Star-Tribune who actually become paying subscribers of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. The Atlantic itself is in the process of turning from a website that has traditionally been free to a website where we're looking for subscribers as well. Right. So if you could let the audience in on your secret and let me in on your secret, that'd be really fantastic.
So it's a good idea you're moving that way, by the way. At Star-Tribune, we're all in on digital subscriptions. We feel that that's our future. We're following in the footsteps of the New York Times. We launched our pay meter on our website just a few months after the New York Times did and have been continuously dedicated to that ever since. So you have to stay with it. You can't give up, and you've got to stay the course. Now, that statistic about second best conversions is accurate. I can confirm that, and I have read that story. So here's what you should know today about Star-Tribune. We have over 90,000 digital subscribers, and as of about a year from now, we will probably have more digital subscribers, a little bit over 100,000 during the weekdays as we have print subscribers, probably also 100,000 print subscribers. So, and another interesting tidbit, on any given day, 4 times as many people touch our content on our digital platforms as touch our content in physical print. Mm-hmm. So we've we've really worked hard at it. We've got great, smart people. We've stayed committed to it, but we've had great success in the digital consumer side of the business.
Right. So local news nationally has been arguably decimated, but you guys are a rare success story. You're an outlier, and it's in sort of the journalistic purview to be fascinated by outlier success stories. So help me understand what it is to which you credit the Star-Tribune's turnaround and its continued buoyancy. Like, what do you understand about what consumers want from local news that's so smart, that's working?
Right. So humbly, I'll submit.
I'll call it smart. You can.
We have a fantastic group of journalists at the Star-Tribune and business people as well. I think many of those journalists may be in the room tonight, so thank you. We have stayed true. So we're a mission-driven company. You know, we're a commercial enterprise, but we're a mission-driven company. Our mission is to cover more of what matters to Minnesota all day, every day. And that we've stayed committed to that mission. We've stayed committed to our investment in our news resource, in our newsroom. I've been there 10 years. We have roughly the same number of people in the newsroom today that we had 10 years ago. You couldn't say that about any other newspaper, metro paper, New York Times, Washington Post is put aside. We've stayed committed to that. We've stayed committed to distinctive local journalism. That's the differentiator for us. It's not our relaying of national news or international news, although we do that. The distinction and the differentiator is our comprehensive coverage of local news. And when I say local news, I mean, things you think about, courthouse and politics, but you should also think about food and arts and business and sports is huge. So those are all part of our purview and part of what we do.
So I went to your website today, and the top story was Kirk Cousins talking to Brett Favre about his hoping to stay in Minneapolis, his hoping to continue being paid by the Vikings. And then I saw the print product, and the front page of the print product was a story about the testimonies happening in Washington, D.C. So there's a slightly different strategy to me that seems to be happening here, that on the website, it's local news and local stories that are getting to the top of the most popular list. Meanwhile, in print, you're still focused on national news on the front page. Is there a strategy there?
Yes. So my view is that in the printed product, when you're constructing A1, the front page of the paper, you've got to lead with that which is most prominent sort of in the zeitgeist. So that's all everybody's talking about is the impeachment today. So if you take that news off your front page and you're just left with local content, which most metro papers have done, the local print product seems unimportant or trivial. Not that there aren't local issues that are critically important, like Kirk Cousins and Brett Favre, but The absence of that national and international news, to me, diminishes the product in print. Here's another little tidbit statistic. Newsstand sales, single copy sales of our newspaper. If you look across the United States of America and all the newspapers that are published on Sunday, here is the rank order of single copy newsstand sale in the United States. Number 1, New York Times. You'd probably guess that. Number 2, New York Post. Number 3, Minneapolis Star-Tribune.
Wow.
We sell more single copy papers than any newspaper not located in New York City. Now, digitally, it's a different story. As you said, if you look at our web traffic and what is differentiating, what our readers want from our web product, it is that local differentiated news.
Right.
And we have the national news there. Sometimes we play it at the top of the website, not always, and still has its role because you have room for everything in a digital platform. But it's the local stuff that gets the traction.
So it's really interesting to me about that because I've talked to a lot of people about local news strategies, and I haven't really heard this theory that when people essentially are going to the website, sometimes they're just looking for like a quick scan. Did I miss anything? Right. Sometimes they're just looking for one story. They want one story. So if it's local, if they're just looking for the latest on Kirk Cousins, they're like, great, boom, I got it. Whereas when they're receiving the paper does not represent a one-off. The paper represents a bundle. It represents all of which they need to be appraised of during the day. And as long as you're getting not the one-off, but the whole bundle, it makes sense to lead with not just here's what the quarterback said yesterday, but here's what's happening to Donald Trump in Washington, D.C.
That sounds like an endorsement of our strategy.
I endorse the strategy.
Yeah,
it might have just been a recapitulation.
So when you think about it, if you're sitting in front of a computer or your phone, right? So if you're here and you're saying, I want to read about the impeachment, you're probably not going to think first of the Star Tribune. We have Washington Post coverage on our phones and on our website, but you can go anywhere. But when you're in front of the print paper, you've got your print paper, and the New York Times isn't sitting there. So I think that's really part of the reason for the differentiation.
All right, so enough nerding out on strategy. I do want to talk about economics just a bit. The nerding out was my fault, so don't worry about that.
Okay. You have a couch here. I could lay down for therapy if you're going to talk about the business.
Well, we are going to talk a little bit of business, so get comfortable. I do think it's important to be clear about the diverging trajectories of the Star Tribune and the St. Paul Pioneer Press. That on the one hand, you guys have been really successful. You're still profitable. You said, have the same size newsroom that you had years ago, despite what's happened in local news across the country. And yet, with the Pioneer Press, it's really been the opposite story. The Pioneer Press, owned by a private equity company, and hedge funds and private equity have come in and bought up a lot of struggling local newspapers in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, in Denver, across the country. It seems to me, as someone sort of looking at the national scene, like private equity and hedge funds getting into the local news business is gutting the local news business and turning it into a way to maintain profit but not maintain journalistic ethics. Am I wrong here?
No, I would give you, in that particular instance, I would give that to you. I would say that not all hedge funds are created equal. Star Tribune, for the first 5 years of my employment here, we were owned in the majority, by a local Twin Cities hedge fund called Wyzetta Investment Partners. They were fantastic stewards. And then in the rest, we were owned by GE Capital and national hedge funds, JP Morgan. But the majority owner was local, a local hedge fund, and they were quite good. So I wouldn't paint that brush across all of the hedge fund universe, but I agree with you in the particular case of Alden Capital and how they've managed their newspapers, which is basically a sad story.
Well, and just tell me a little bit about how you see places like Alden Capital and Digital First Media. How are they managing the papers that they're buying?
Again, I think this has been widely reported, but I don't think it's any secret that they go in. It's basically a strip mining process to preserve the profit margins. The revenues are still falling, but they maintain their profit margins by stripping resources, no commitment to the news enterprise, and then they hang a big high for sale price on the property and try to sell it.
Yeah. So one concern that I have had as someone looking at the local news scene across the country is that you see so many of these papers being bought up by billionaires, by hedge funds, by private equity, or sometimes being rescued by some philanthropy. I think some people are arguing for local government to come in and save institutions with the argument that they are good, they have public benefit, so they should have public investment. There's a suggestion here, at least an implication, that local news can't stand on its own 2 feet, that it needs the assistance of either an individual, an organization, or a government body with a lot of wealth.
Right.
Do you have that fear that local news in this country cannot stand on its 2 feet?
No, I don't believe that. I think we're example A of being able to stand on your own 2 feet. And just a couple of things I'd say about so we're owned by a billionaire. And I've talked to 2 other billionaires who own newspapers. None of those 3 billionaires want to lose money on their newspapers. They're not in this as a charity. They are community-minded, they're great owners, but look, we don't have a carte blanche to write checks. They don't pull up a truck full of money. We're on our own to support ourselves and sustain ourselves, and I know in the case of Boston and Los Angeles that to be true also. So that's a great ownership, but it doesn't imply, it's party time. So as concerns philanthropy, I think there's a history of that working in instances. So we have 2 great news operations here in the Twin Cities. We have Minnesota Public Radio, one of the greatest public radio stations in the country. That model's been philanthropy, membership, so either individual support or philanthropic support, a touch of government support in there, which I don't like because I think that can put you in a position of conflict of interest. I don't believe government should be involved in funding the free press. But so you've got NPR, you've got MinPost, a smaller example of a high-quality, small local news website that's supported in whole by philanthropy. So I think at different levels there are roles for that to play. But I think, frankly, you've got to have business discipline and you have to have commercial motivation to run a quality company that is in the media business. And even if you're a nonprofit, I mean, you still have to have enough cash every year to fund you. I know a lot of people here are probably in nonprofits. You have to have cash sufficiency. That doesn't mean you can lose money. It just means you don't pay any taxes.
Yeah. I think we do have time for one question. We're going to go right here.
Hi, I'm from northern Minnesota, and I'm very aware that about half of Minnesota's population lives in what we would call rural places. The Star Tribune is going to open a bureau, I understand, in Duluth. Can you talk about the importance of the rural audience and how you've addressed that?
Right, thanks very much. So you're right on the news. We announced today that we're opening a 4-person bureau in Duluth to cover that area, not just Duluth, but Superior and the surrounding counties. So I think for a long time people thought that it was the major metros that had been hit the hardest by the economic dislocation, and I think that was true at the outset. But now that is migrating to the smaller papers and the smaller markets, as digital advertising now is available even in those small markets. Originally, it was the retail advertisers moving to digital that caused the collapse of major metro revenues. That's now migrated to the smaller markets. So we're asking ourselves, is there a role we can play to enhance the availability of news and information in markets outside the Twin Cities? And Duluth is sort of a beta for us to test that principle. But it's interesting because all we have to do to have a presence there is put 4 people incrementally there. They're supported by all of our infrastructure back here in the Twin Cities. So as opposed to starting up or being an enterprise that just operates there with all of the associated infrastructure, on a marginal basis, you can do that relatively efficient, and we're really interested to see. Our goal there, of course, is to grow our digital audience. This is a digital play, by the way. This is not a print play, even though you can buy print copies of the Star Tribune all across the state still. 85% of our print circulation is in the Twin Cities, but 30% of our digital subscriptions are outside the Twin Cities. So, and half of that is outside the state of Minnesota. So it's an interesting idea. We don't know yet whether that will work, but we're going to pursue that to see if we can be a contributor to the broader news ecosystem. We consider ourselves a state paper as a strategy.
That's great. Thank you for the question, and please join me in thanking Mike.
All right.
Thank you.
And now, For a conversation on making local news matter, please welcome to the stage MPR's Angela Davis and the Center for Investigative Reporting's Editor-in-Chief, Matt Thompson.
Hello.
Hi, Matt.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And Angela, it is a pleasure to get to sit down with you. 15 years ago, around 15 years ago when we met, I was at the Star Tribune, and you were about to make the transition probably from KSTP to WCCO as news anchor. And now we are both found our way from these for-profit media companies to public media.
We saw the light.
Indeed we did, apparently. So tell me a little bit, why did you make the switch from WCCO to now NPR News, where you are a host of a show?
You know, when I moved to Minnesota back in 1994, I was a young woman in my 20s. I was single, and over the 25 years I've lived here, I've gotten married, had kids, I bought a house, I've switched jobs a couple of times, and I was able to work in 2 extraordinary newsrooms and fulfill a lot of my own personal goals as a journalist. But as I got older and a little bit more reflective about life, I found myself wanting more for myself as a journalist in terms of what I am able to contribute to a community which has given a lot to me. And I wanted an opportunity to do work that I felt was more meaningful and more memorable. So I love television. I've wanted to be in TV since I was 12 years old, as I told you, since I was a little girl. But as a woman now in her 50s, what I really love is helping people become more informed. You know, you've lived here in the early 2000s, and since you lived here, Minnesota has changed a lot.
Yeah.
So the theme of the talk show that I'm doing now at Minnesota Public Radio, which I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to do, an hour each weekday, is to talk about the many ways Minnesota is changing. So that was a great opportunity for me to have this time, an hour, compared to a television news report, which is typically maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes if you're reporting. And then if you're a news anchor, you know, you really don't have great editorial control over what's in that newscast. So I was very drawn to the idea of having an hour to slow things down and really dig a lot deeper than what you see in headlines and in newscasts. And one of the big ways Minnesota is changing is that it's becoming more diverse. Mm-hmm. And, you know, right now in Minnesota, 1 out of 5 people who live in Minnesota is a person of color.
Wow.
And I don't know that people realize that, because a lot of people still say, in fact, I have voicemails now that's like, Angela, why are you always talking about race? Like, this is a state that has a lot of white people. Just like, get used to it, right? But increasingly, we're becoming a lot more diverse. And in the metro area, even more so. So, Matt, back in 1970, I think it's like 2.7% of people living in Minnesota were people of color. Mm. Fast forward to today, that number's at 27%. In the 7-county metro area. So that's a tenfold difference. And I think our news organizations, we have not kept pace with that increase in the number of people of color, and as well as, you know, our fastest growing population would be people who are 65 and older. Mm. So people who are 65 and older, beginning in 2020, which is next year in a few months, that group of people will be a larger population than school-age kids between 5 and 17. So having a chance to have a talk show to look at issues that affect people who are aging and people learning to get along with those who are different than them, whether, you know, it's your coworker, whether it's your new neighbor, whether it's the kids that your children are playing with, having an opportunity to have conversations about how our state is changing, and you know, you don't have to be afraid of it or uncomfortable with it. Listen to the voices of these people, and maybe you'll have a better understanding and, you know, live your life in a little different way.
I mean, this was one of the things I think that was most striking for me, being in Minnesota and then from here going to D.C. There's this perception, we say this word heartland, and there's this perception that even 15 years ago was false of Minnesota as a place that was only or solely white. In fact, there was a lot of diversity in the Twin Cities and in the state more broadly. And I think this continues certainly to affect, from a national perspective, how the national media sees and covers the Twin Cities and Minnesota more broadly. I'm curious, from a local vantage point, do you think that local news organizations have done a better job of reflecting the true picture of the state?
We're getting better. We still could be a lot better. There are a lot of stories that just don't get told. And, you know, when you talk about the national media, there are a number of occasions in the last year that national media has come in and like scooped us on stories that we should have been doing, as in Worthington. You know, the Washington Post just did a story about a school bus driver in Worthington. They came here to look at how this community is changing. They've had this influx of immigrants, and many of the families who've lived there for generations are not real happy about that. And, you know, I saw that story. It was very compelling, and I'm like, I wish we had done that story, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, the New York Times has come here and done stories as well. I think our news departments are trying, but we're still not getting there in terms of really spending the time trying to develop new sources and create these connections and, you know, give our reporters time to develop relationships. So certainly I think in public radio we are doing a better job of it than the local TV stations are doing. Part of that has to do with staffing. You know, TV, their staffs are very small, but still there are story ideas that never make it to that morning staff meeting, because when you look at the people in the room who are pitching story ideas, who are making decisions in newscasts, you're not finding people of color. And, you know, quite frankly, you're not going to develop those relationships, and these story ideas are just not even going to be on the radar. And I think we have an obligation. I feel like our news staff should reflect the communities that we're covering.
Yeah.
When in my last job, I was the only black woman in a whole building.
Wow.
Any department, you pick it, I was it. And I used to think about that when I walked into work every day. If you picked any other business along downtown Minneapolis, would you find that in any other business, regardless of what product they were selling? You wouldn't. And for a news organization to have so much power and influence, we need to do a better job of, you know, increasing the numbers of people of color. Diversity has all kinds of meanings. You know, I used to pitch a lot of stories that dealt with greater Minnesota or rural communities, because that's another way that we are different. But I think we've been very slow to respond. I mean, I came in 1994. Now in 2019, I don't think the numbers are much better in newsrooms than they were when I was here in 94.
Wow.
I mean, I've seen people like you who are heavily recruited by news organizations who leave.
Yeah.
And we just haven't kept pace in trying to recruit and retain talented people of color.
Now, in addition to making a shift from for-profit media to public media, you also made the shift from television to audio. And to radio. How has that shifted your approach? How has the medium changed the stories that you can tell and the way that you can tell them?
Well, I mentioned the time. Having an hour is great, but also being in a studio with just the microphone. So it's a very intimate setting, both for the guests who I'm interviewing and for the listener. So what I loved about TV, what I still love about TV, is the visuals. I mean, you can't compete with visuals. Video in itself can tell a story. It's very powerful, but without often the time and the effort to put that video into context, you lose something. An example today, we did a show about retirement savings. How do you save money for retirement? And having an opportunity to have two financial experts in for an hour to explain the problem, why it's hard, why, you know, it's just hard to save money, period. But what we're seeing with people recognizing that, you know, they're not going to be able to retire at 65, and then, you know, most people have accepted the fact that they're going to work till they're 74 or older. But then having our listeners call in and share their stories about why they can't save money. And you can hear the pain and distress in their voices. So I think that's very powerful, having this very personal experience of listening to someone share their story, and in your mind trying to think about, you know, kind of absorb that information. And again, having the time to really fully explore a topic and bring in multiple different points of view on a topic. My intent is never to change anybody's mind about how they feel about an issue or a topic, but I can bring in a voice that maybe you have not ever had an opportunity to, to listen to, whether if one of the recurring themes on our show, we do a lot on health, mental health, as well as workplace issues. And so having an opportunity to sit with someone who's not just a PhD, you don't have to be an expert in. You don't have to have a PhD to be an expert in something. If you are living with schizophrenia, you're an expert in that, right? And so we try to pair people who are experiencing an issue along with someone who has studied it. And together, it's a very powerful thing, I think.
Yeah. In a moment, I'm going to turn to the audience for a question, but I'll take moderator's prerogative to ask another first. So as a local news host and as a public radio host, you occupy a distinct and I would say increasingly rare position of trust among the public. Trust in the media, in journalists in general, nationally, has been steadily declining for decades. It reached a high water mark in the 70s, but it's been going down for a long time. One of the places where the public still does place trust in their journalists is in local news. As a local news anchor, you are among the most trusted voices in the news ecosystem more broadly. How do you build that trust? How do you maintain it?
I think by being here and living here, and as a journalist, we work long hours, but making an effort to really immerse yourself in your community by doing volunteer work, by going to events when people ask you to speak at events, by asking your friends and your neighbors, asking them for story ideas, asking them what they're interested in, by being visible. And on the air, when I interview people and I ask questions, I put myself in the frame of mind of the listeners. What would the listener want to know? And I try to reveal and show to people I'm like you, right? I'm trying to figure out how to save enough money for retirement. And by disclosing that you have the same curiosity about things that they do, and being willing to show yourself and share yourself in your reporting as you're interviewing people, and letting people know that you don't think that you're smarter or better than them. You're like them. We all share this cold space we call Minnesota, but we're all experiencing it different ways. So I think the way I do it is through volunteer work and just by being here and by staying and by choosing to stay and be here and go through some of the many life changes that people who live here for a long time have also gone through. Yeah.
Now I have two rules. No manifestos. Ask an actual interrogative question as I turn to the mic. Over there in the back.
Hi, I'm Kim Hansen with the Bloomington Chamber of Commerce.
Hi.
And I listened to your program today. It was great.
Thank you.
How is the atmosphere at work different because you are listener funded and grant funded as opposed to at a television station where it's advertising revenue? How is it different for you guys as employees?
I think we feel a very distinct connection to our listeners because we know that we are publicly funded. I think half of our funding comes from our listeners through their donations. And I think the journalists who I work with, who are all very thoughtful and all very, take their jobs very seriously, always sort of have that listener in mind, and we view what we do as a partnership with the people in the community, and that we're public media, we're part of the public, and we're there to not try to please advertisers, not try to make one part of the community happier than the other, because that's the part of the community that helps us generate more revenue. I think we feel a very distinct connection with our listeners, and that we chose public media because we knew that existed and that there would be fewer barriers to just getting to the truth and being willing to explore, as many voices as necessary to get a story where it needs to be. Right.
Other questions? I think we have room. There's one over here in the front.
My name is Joel. I'm from Southwest Minneapolis, proud print subscriber and NPR member. I'm curious, on the flip of that, in the intro, it was mentioned how one of the things you fight is misinformation. How do you reach more diverse audiences throughout Minnesota? And how do you build that audience? How does NPR do that in this day and age like that?
Building more diverse audiences. Well, one of the things that NPR has done is we've created some very unique beats. We have a team of reporters. I hope I get this right. I believe it's race, class, and communities. So we have a team of reporters. Thank you, my boss is yeah, who focus on trying to see and hear these very diverse communities, whether they're immigrant communities or people who are sort of outside of what people think of as being mainly our public radio listeners. And so a lot of time and resources are devoted to trying to bring people together and letting them know that we know that you're there, we see you, we're trying to establish relationships with you. Back in March, I believe, I hope I have the date right, we co-hosted a large conference on racial narratives and transformation on the campus of Hamline University, I believe with the Minnesota Humanities Center, is that right? And bringing the community together as well as community journalists and talking about, what are the stories that we need to have on our air and who are the leaders in these communities and what are your ideas about, what the broader community needs to know about how Minnesota is changing. So a lot of effort is put in both our, planning and teams and developing beats that allow people to develop relationships with immigrant communities and people who we just don't see in mainstream media a lot. Our reporters are a great source for me. I go to them a lot about, what are you working on? And, do you want to come on and talk about it more? Or give me some ideas of some people that you met that didn't make it into your story, but you could see would be a great source for me. And I think we have made it a priority to be inclusive and to tell the stories of the people who are also Minnesotans who we just haven't gotten to know yet. So many of our immigrant communities, if I look at the Hmong community, they've really become way more established now. Their experiences are much different than probably what they were in the 90s when I moved here. I did a show with, it was 3 of I believe now, we have 7 state lawmakers. So in our state Senate and our state, in the House, we have a whole caucus of Hmong legislators. And so these 3 of them came in and talked with us about their childhood experiences and having to grow up fast because they were the interpreters for their families.
Right. Yeah.
And that moment, I'm like, I never thought I would see the day that they have their own caucus, and here I am doing a talk show with 3 Hmong legislators. So I think it's constantly on our radar. It's a priority, and I think we're making a lot of progress. And they are sharing ideas with us because they know that we will respond, and it's been a great asset to have them, contribute ideas to us because they know that we see them.
And in a few minutes, we'll be back to speak about misinformation specifically. So thank you for the question. And Angela, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for coming back to Minnesota.
Yes.
And now, a session brought to you by our underwriter. Please welcome to the stage Catherine Badalamente, Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at Graham Media Group, and Chrissy Tao, Head of News and Local Media at Google.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking The Atlantic and the Star Tribune for putting on this amazing event. We are really excited to be here. And thank you, Catherine, for joining me on stage to talk about something so important as the future of local news.
You're welcome.
So I'm here representing Google, and I want to just take a moment to share why we care so deeply about news at Google. We're a search engine, and it's absolutely critical that we have an open and flourishing web so that we can fulfill our mission statement of making all information useful and accessible to the world. So it's absolutely critical that we have a flourishing open web. So we spend a lot of time supporting the news industry through the Google News Initiative and also through our partnerships with publishers like Graham Media Group, as well as The Atlantic and the Star Tribune. So Really excited to have Catherine here today. As they mentioned, Catherine is the Chief Innovation Officer at Graham Media Group, who owns and operates 7 local stations in the U.S., and in my opinion, is really one of the most forward-thinking publishers in the country. So excited to have Catherine here to have a different perspective. And I think a lot of times when we talk about the future of local news, we think about it through the lens of a legacy print organization. But I think there's a lot of great innovation coming out of the broadcast groups. So we're going to have a conversation about that today. So Catherine, to kick it off, why don't you talk a little bit about why you think it's so important for broadcasters to start innovating now?
Well, I would honestly tell you we should have been innovating a lot faster many years ago, but hopefully we're starting to move in that direction more than we have in the past. We have a really unique relationship with our audiences. We hear from Pew that we are the most trusted local news source, and I think that we shouldn't squander that relationship. So looking at our unique position that we have today, we have to learn to take what we have today and put it towards some of those really exciting opportunities for the future. And I'll be honest and tell you that right now broadcasters aren't moving quick enough.
Mm-hmm. When was the moment in which Graham Media Group really clicked for innovation?
Well, I think actually our president and CEO, she started with us in 2012. And at the time, we had literally I always say a 1.5 digital team at the corporate level. It was literally 3 people. I was one of them that had half station responsibilities and half corporate responsibilities. So between the 3 of us, we made 1.5 people. She came in and literally said, you have all these things you're trying to accomplish, and I can tell that you're not able to do the good work that we need to do. And so she said to me at the time, do you think that you can do it in Detroit, which is where I'm based? And I said, yes, I think I can. And she said, do you think you can find enough good people? And I said, yes, I think I can. So we have now in Detroit 28 people on the digital team, making up everything from content to technology. And we have what I think is the best development company in the world, and we're really focused on that. It really has happened just in the last few years.
Fantastic. Why do you think other broadcast groups may be slower to innovate?
Well, we're what you consider a boutique broadcast group because there's a whopping 7 stations in our group. I'm sure you all know that there are many bigger broadcasters. Sinclair, for instance, is over 150 stations across the country. Those are very big ships that they have to steer. And so I think that it actually puts us in a huge advantage because of the fact that we can move a lot faster than they can. If we need to roll something out against our 7 stations, it's a lot easier than doing that against 150.
Absolutely. So some of the challenges facing the broadcast industry are definitely different than legacy print, but similar at the same time. I'm curious to hear how you are combating some of these threats.
Well, I'm sure anyone who's familiar with the broadcast business understands that we were literally thrown like a great big life preserver a few years ago, which is called the retransmission consent. That is the fees that the satellite and cable companies pay us for our stations. And for a long time, they weren't paying local stations for our content, and that changed usually around 2010, 2011. And that literally gave us this immediate boom to our overall revenue. And what that did was it literally hid the fact that our advertising revenues are suffering just like other local media companies and media companies in general. And so we've been very lucky because we've been incredibly profitable. We've had retransmission and political really keeping us in a great position revenue-wise. But both of those things, as you all know, are under extreme threat. So what we're trying to do is really look at diversification of revenue and say, we have to really first and foremost get our people to realize that this is happening. And you'd be surprised how many people still feel like this is not a situation where we have to move as quick as we need to. I'm always stunned when I go and actually hear from people at the general manager level. They don't feel a lot of pressure to change. Wow. And it's kind of scary when you actually sit and talk to station leaders, because they still are making a lot of money and they really don't feel the pinch, and they're also saying, I've got 5 years and I'm out. So it's a severe situation for us that I'm pretty vocal about whenever I'm talking to anybody when we're talking about the broadcast business in general.
So you talked about revenue diversification. What does that look like at Grand Media Group?
Well, first and foremost, I think that we're really looking at what we're really good at. And one of the things that we're, obviously video as being something that we've always had this unique position in the marketplace. I got really frustrated a few years ago and looked at the fact that we were literally letting Facebook take away what was our value to the markets, specifically with things like Facebook Live. We would be covering a hurricane in Houston, and I would literally see our entire team on Facebook Live and no one putting any sort of energy towards our own products. And so I immediately said, we've got to stop doing things like that. And so making sure that video is, putting the right kind of technology and resources behind it so we stay ahead of the pack, frankly, and not giving up our dominance in that position. And clearly we know that video is a place where you can actually make money. So if we continue to innovate on the video side and stay ahead of the pack, I think that that's going to allow us to continue to, find new ways of developing new revenue streams. The other thing that we're really looking at is, believe it or not, membership for broadcast. And when I first started talking to different people about this idea, especially people coming from maybe a more traditional newspaper background, they kind of couldn't understand what we were talking about because, of course, they're thinking it's more paywall or subscription-based. And the truth is that our local television stations, because of our unique relationship with the audience, the fact that we have these people that are in living rooms and bedrooms and are coming across the screen every day, that relationship is insanely strong. We also know, too, that we can move the needle. And, I have people on my team that have come from different backgrounds and different media, and they'll say, we ask the audience to do something, and they do it. I've never seen the power of this before. Yeah. And so kind of leaning into that and exploring what membership could mean on the broadcast side, everything from direct-to-consumer to being able to actually look at events, all things that are being done out there, but frankly, things that we always do most times for our advertisers and not actually for ourselves. So we're really looking into that and exploring that in a big way. We got a Google G&I grant to be able to help support that effort this year. So very excited to be leading the entire industry on looking at what membership can mean.
We are also really excited about what that's going to look like. And I know you launched a pilot back last year with San Antonio station.
We did.
I'm curious to hear, what did membership look like in San Antonio?
Well, we have this powerhouse television station in San Antonio, KSAT, and that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to work with them. This was actually through the Knight-funded Table Stakes project at the Arizona State University. We went into that and we had to come up with some big goal and do something that was not on our roadmap for the future, and that's really when I wanted to explore membership. And I remember our coaches from Table Stakes said, I don't know if that's a good idea, Catherine. I think you should just try to grow your highly engaged users. And I was like, nah, I don't think that's what I want to do. I think we really want to see what this can look like. So just like any other first project, we learned a lot along the way, and there's still things that I would tell you I wish that we would have done differently. It was really about exploring our relationship with the audience and, frankly, listening to them more. Broadcast is this one-to-many, where we were like, we need to be more like one-to-one and really listen to our audiences and fill that unique void in some of our communities that we are seeing, and that we have to make sure that we are doing, actually creating our content and the news that we create so much different than what we do on the broadcast TV side. So it really turned, I'll be honest, into an events business. That's not what I really want this membership relationship to turn into. I want it to be much more robust than that and really be about and when you're looking at an audience funnel, that part in the middle, which is all about making sure that we're answering our consumers and doing what's right for them, and both our audience and our advertisers, so that we have a better relationship with all of them. So that really is where we're going with this in the coming year and where we really want to explore it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and congrats for all that you have done with Grand Media Group.
Thank you.
To discuss what happens when misinformation goes viral, please welcome to the stage Emily Vraga, Associate Professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism at the University of Minnesota, Ed Ellinger, the former Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Health, and Kat Matza, Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. Matt Thompson is back to lead the conversation.
I promised we would talk about misinformation and disinformation, and here we are. A lot of times when we talk about these subjects, from a national perspective, we're talking about partisan polarization. We're talking about politics, national, federal politics. But I want us to start by talking about an incident from 2 years ago, a measles outbreak that affected the state of Minnesota more dramatically than almost anywhere else in the country in 2017. And Ed, I want to start with you. You were health commissioner in the city at the time that this outbreak happened. And I just want you to take us into that story. What role did misinformation play in that outbreak?
Well, thank you for having us here, and thank you for talking about measles. It's always good to talk about public health. But we know we had a measles outbreak in 1990, and we really worked hard at that point to increase immunization rates. And we had done very well for several decades. But then in our community, we had a decreasing immunization rate, particularly among Somalis, immigrants to this country, and they were targeted with information that the measles vaccination was linked to autism, and autism is a major concern in the Somali community. So their immunization rates dropped dramatically from about 90% down to 41%, and that gave the foothold for the disease to come into our state. And we then, in 2017, had an outbreak of 75 cases. 91% were unvaccinated, and about 2/3 of them were in the Somali community, which had been targeted with information by a disbarred physician and a group of anti-vaxxers to give information to that community that they shouldn't get vaccinated because it is linked to autism. And it really took off in that community. And so we really struggled to turn over that, change the information, change the narrative, and really it took a lot of work to do that until we finally got the immunization rates back up to about 90%, with a lot of help from the media, but also from the medical community and from the Somali community itself.
From your vantage point, when did you first understand that this was happening? Where did you see this outbreak begin? Where did you see vaccination rates start falling off? How did the story first come?
We saw when, over the previous 5 years or so, we knew that the anti-vaccination information was coming into the state. And so we really worked with the Somali community. And we did, with our surveillance, we saw that the rates of immunization were going down. So we knew it was just a matter of time before something would happen. And so we really started to try to work to overturn that. But it's a very difficult task to overturn that misinformation when people want to blame something and somebody for the problems that their children are having.
Yeah. Emily, you study health communications, you study, when we were talking just a second ago backstage, we were talking about misinformation and disinformation almost as an info virus infecting and spreading among a community. For this episode in particular, how did it happen to spread? How was it that folks came to trust information that was countervailing to a pretty entrenched and established scientific consensus?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors at play. One of which I think that Ed already identified, there was a gap. People didn't like the current medical explanation, and they wanted to feel like there was something they could do. The misinformation gave them that. It said, you don't want your child to get sick, you don't want them to get autism, just don't vaccinate them. And that's a really obvious solution if you believe it. I also think there is a trust gap, that maybe they aren't trusting the medical professionals who are trying to give them that accurate information. So I think part of what turned it around is all of the community coming together. It's not just the newspapers, it's not just the medical professionals, but also the community members.
Now, I want to come to that trust gap specifically and talking with you, Kat. You are at the Pew Research Center, where you have been researching that gap in trust and the decline of trust in journalistic institutions. Pew has been covering this for decades in surveys. What has caused it from your perspective? What are you seeing? How has it partisanship? What are the dynamics that have caused folks to diminish trust in their news organizations?
You're absolutely right. This is not something new. We've seen this kind of like trend the past 20 years and more, and others have documented this kind of like decline in trust in the news media And it's not just the news media, it's a lot of different institutions in the US that we are seeing this kind of like lack of confidence in how they operate. Scientists is one of them, and doctors, but also academics and academia in general. So thinking about it of like what might have caused it and what we are seeing in the data, we definitely are seeing this kind of like, as you mentioned in the beginning, polarization or political polarization, which is also a phenomenon that is happening in the US, where basically Republicans and Democrats are, especially in the news media, have this very different attitudes towards the news media. And it's not only about trust, but it has to do with the role of the news media, that how they play in society, but also where they turn to for news. It's a very different media environment for each of these two groups.
Who do people see as being responsible for the spread of misinformation and disinformation?
So we did this large survey, kind of like trying to untangle this kind of like misinformation environment. And one of the things we found is that predominantly Americans believe that politicians, elected officials are the culprits of spreading misinformation. However, it's interesting, and journalists were much in a lesser extent. Interestingly, when it came to questions about responsibility and who should be stepping in and trying to fix it, journalists were in the news media were the ones that people believe that need to lead and fix this.
So my understanding is that local journalists retain more trust than national journalists overall. And Ed, I'm curious from your perspective, what was the role of the local media ecosystem, the local and national media ecosystem, in either furthering or combating the spread of misinformation around vaccination?
Certainly, those of us in the public health community use the media to get out the messages, the public health messages. So they were really important on sort of, as you said, sort of putting a cone around the misinformation. So we tried to get the information out to the local media so they could get it to the local community papers, to the radios and television stations, while we actually did the information work with the community itself, actually meeting with folks. So they were our tools to actually provide the information to really, build that wall around the misinformation as best we could.
And Emily, from your vantage point, what were the most effective methods within the health communications community for combating the spread of misinfo?
So I largely look at this in the terms of social media, which is really important because there's a lot of health misinformation on social media. And local news organizations can actually help in 3 different ways with that. First, by providing really high quality information, exactly what you're talking about, because that gives us the resources to respond to misinformation and to know what's accurate. 2, they can respond to misinformation themselves, so you don't have to rely on other people, on doctors. If you see somebody spreading misinformation and you're a local news organization, use that trust, use that responsibility that's being placed on you to respond. And 3rd, by helping people become more news literate to understand how news creates its content. We've seen that it seems to act almost as an inoculation, helping people resist misinformation better.
Yeah. And Kat, one of the sources, or the sources of blame, I guess, for this rise in misinformation, and also for the paired trend with it, the decline, the diminishment in a lot of places of local news and local journalism, has been the internet and social media, and the fact that there are fewer gatekeepers and that fewer institutions can play a gatekeeping function. But there's a countervailing point to that too, in that people can also see themselves represented more. They can have a voice in spreading information themselves and in being reflected in the media landscape more broadly. And I'm curious how that shakes out in terms of public opinion. Do people's ability to control themselves, to participate in the flow of news, how has that affected the trust that they place in the spread of news overall?
I mean, definitely the experience of the news experience has changed. Like, that's something we've seen. I mean, I've worked with the center now for 9 years. It's one of the big things that we are seeing. The way people interact, the environment that they're in has really changed. And it's right, it's because of social media. You're having this kind of like more integrated experience with news that was not the case before. Local news is a big part of that, and especially because what we've seen when it comes to local news and studying about local news, you see that kind of like community connection that plays a very big role in trust, in how you assess your local journalists and how you believe that your local news media are doing in society, like kind of like having that connection, talking to a local journalist, all these measures that show this kind of community engagement really plays a role in how people perceive their media, their news media, in the local level.
Yeah. It's easy to understand at a national level how something like politics could result in these very different information landscapes where people are in different media environments, they're hearing and they're trusting different information about what's happening. But when it comes to issues that are really, that affect people personally, health, schooling, transportation, even, it's harder to understand how misinformation spreads. It's harder for me, I should say, to understand how misinformation spreads. Is there any difference from what you're seeing in the numbers, Kat, at Pew, in how people are receiving political information from information on subjects like health?
I mean, yes and no, I would say. Definitely there are pockets of people on how they interact with misinformation, and there's difference. Literacy, digital literacy, it's a big play here. So even if you see these partisan divides, how good you are with using the internet and being able to manage social media plays a role in how you can identify misinformation, which is very much related also to age. Younger people are better at being able to manage misinformation online. So you're right, it's not only this kind of like partisan divide, but there is also an inherent technological, in a way, challenge that it's there, and people are trying to kind of like figure out what is coming to them.
Yeah. So Ed, bring us forward a couple years from this outbreak. How has the picture changed now? How has the community responded to the outbreak, and how is the dynamic different?
Well, we got the immunization rates up. We got the medical community engaged with the Somali community. We got the information out. But as time goes on, the anti-vaxxers are continually put out information, and the immunization rates among the Somali community are coming down again. So fortunately, we didn't have any cases this year, but the risk is still there. So we just have to continue to work with our media colleagues to try to get good information out. But they don't want to talk about immunizations when there's no outbreak. They only want to talk about it when there is an outbreak. But get your flu shot. But we're also, and then trying to build connections with the local communities themselves to get that information out. And then, you know, we always struggle. All of these issues, you talk about transportation or housing and health, they're all complex issues. The social media only really gets things at a black-white, you know, right and wrong perspective, and ideology always gets in the way of actual data. And so our continual thing is, you know, continually talk about who can you trust? Can you trust the government? Can you trust can you trust your provider? We need the media to kind of give support to the really good science so that we can have the conversation, which is going to be an ongoing thing.
Yeah. In a moment, again, I'm going to turn to the crowd for a few questions. But Emily, I wanted to ask you the question, what can we learn from how health communications is playing out, and specifically from episodes like the measles outbreak? What can we learn that we can apply to other domains like city and national politics, and housing and education?
So local news is incredibly important for that because it is a little bit less polarized than some of these other spaces that we're talking about. It has the opportunity to speak across lines of difference, whether they're partisan, whether they're age, whether they're gender, in a way that few of our other media are able to. Much as social media has its ills, though, I don't think we can ignore it. I think it's going to be an increasing part of that landscape, and so really figuring out how to make sure people are getting quality information, and when there isn't quality information out there, doing our part to respond to it.
How much just one more I'll throw in there. How much does representation matter? How much does it matter who is sending the messages and how much they reflect the community that's receiving the messages?
Quite a lot. I mean, one of the reasons we like social media is we get to see people like us, people that we trust, sharing information. Luckily, local news, unlike a lot of the other organizations mentioned, still maintains a higher trust than a lot of other sources, so leveraging that's important.
Now let's turn to the crowd. We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Michael Griffin. I'm from Macalester College, and I had a question for Ms. Matza. When you were mentioning that young people seem to be able to handle misinformation better online, I wonder if you could explain that a little more specifically, because it kind of runs counter to my experience.
Yes. So we did I think it has been a year, we did a study of basically trying to understand factual and opinion statements. And we run this basically experiments with our panel. And what we found is that younger people, those that are more engaged in the political process and more informed and more digital savvy, were more likely to be able to identify and categorize basically factual statements correctly, rather than assigning them as opinions and vice versa. That's also something that we saw also this year when it came to misinformation specifically, kind of like the ideas of like spreading and how pessimistic you are for the future about misinformation. Younger people seem to be a bit more able to identify misinformation and not spread it, but also more optimistic about the future.
Don't gloat too much, millennials and Xennials. By the way.
I would just like to add on, there was at least one study that looked at the 2016 election and found that on Facebook it was older people who were sharing more misinformation.
Hi, I'm Allison Ashawn. I'm with the Blandin Foundation in Grand Rapids. And I understand that Minnesota has a very strong network of newspapers. We've got 300 newspapers in the state, almost all of which are in rural places. Can you talk about the importance for Minnesota of that network of seasoned journalism in place?
Well, I can certainly do, because one of my, I've been going, when I was commissioner, went around the state actually meeting with the librarians and all of the communities and the county commissioners and trying to always make a time to talk with the local news media and their editorial thing, because their health is really a local issue, and trying to get that information out. And they read the local newspaper, really do. And so anytime we can get articles in there and get information out, and then make the link between local public health and local medical community with the newspaper or media, TV, radio, it really helped. And that's just one way of distributing the information throughout the state. I found it very effective.
I've got to say, being back in Minnesota, pride yourselves on the preciousness of your still thriving and robust media ecosystem, because it's not the case everywhere. And the fact that I went to the Star Tribune earlier today, and the newsroom has improved leaps and heads and shoulders above where it was 15 years ago is astonishing. So, got to be protected. Ed, Emily, Kat, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and thanks again to all of you.
Thank you.
And now, what's next for news? Please welcome to the stage Andrew Wallmeyer, publisher and CEO of MinPost, Carrie Patey, news director at WCCO TV, Mukhtar Ibrahim, the founder and editor of the Sahan Journal, and Dee Hall, the co-founder and managing editor of the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. Derek Thompson is back to lead the conversation.
Hello again. This is a town hall, which means that I'm going to be both interviewing everyone you see on stage and also coming to you more often for questions. So be ready as I incorporate you into this segment. I want to start by getting you all involved with one pretty simple question, and that's, you come from such different organizations. We have such an incredible diversity of media and perspectives on this stage. Can we just go down the line, tell me where it is that you come from, your organization, and give me an example of the piece of media that you are most proud of producing most recently? What most typifies your media organization? Dee, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Dee Hall. I'm the managing editor of the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. We're based at the UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So a story that would typify what we do, one of our guiding values is protect the vulnerable. And we did a story a couple of years ago that I think really gets to that point. We did a mail survey of inmates in long-term solitary confinement because you cannot interview them. There's no way to really communicate with them. And we surveyed 100 men in long-term solitary confinement, and then we printed the results, which of course showed that there was a lot of issues that came up, a lot of mental health issues, medical issues, isolation, social deprivation, but that story took months. It took months to get the responses back, to collate them, and then to do interviews around that. So that would be a story that we would do that a lot of news organizations probably would not bother with.
Fantastic. Mukhtar.
Hello, my name is Mukhtar Ibrahim. I am the founder and executive director of Sahan Journal. It's a new nonprofit news organization that covers immigrants and refugees in Minnesota, and we are based in St. Paul. We've been doing a lot of great work, and one story that we recently did, actually we published it today, is we had a local election in St. Paul last week, and for the first time in the history of St. Paul, there will be 3 council members out of the 7 council members in St. Paul who will be of Asian Americans. And we did a story about that and what it means for the city of St. Paul and the changing demographics of the city. So our mission is to really tell stories about the successes, challenges, and transformations of immigrants and refugees in Minnesota. And that's one story that can exemplify the work we are doing. And it's published today, so you can read it.
Brilliant.
It's news.
Carrie.
At WCCO, we like to cover what makes Minnesota great. You know, this is our community, and we're the locals, and we cover it like that. And so I could just say I cover the weather. Well, I do cover the weather really well. One proud moment is actually a story we're still working on, and we have for the most of the year, where there's a pollution investigation in the East Metro. And we've been asking a lot of questions, and we're holding the company and the powers that be accountable. And thanks to our reporting, we've been able to really bring some answers to the community who are concerned about their health. There's a cancer-causing chemical that's been emitting for more than a decade. And so we definitely are holding the state and the locals accountable to make sure our community is safe. And that's making our community better at its very core.
Thank you. And last but not least, Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andy Wallmeyer. I'm the CEO and publisher of MinPost, a 12-year-old nonprofit digital news startup. We exist to be the ultimate user's guide to Minnesota democracy and cover Minnesota politics and policy better than anybody else. And I think, an area of coverage, there have been a couple of proposed mining projects in northern Minnesota that have been very controversial, and even a couple of presidential candidates have weighed in on them. But they're very complicated topics, both to understand in their technicalities and in their political implications and debate for the state. I think we've had some really fine coverage of those policy issues, and I think if there's one thing that stood out to me, we had a great extended interview with the governor, moderate Democrat, first term. People didn't really know where he stood on some of these issues, and had a really good conversation with him that I think showed people where he was for the first time.
That's great. So we have just an incredible diversity of perspectives portrayed up here. Carrie, my first question is for you. You are from the area, then you moved to New York City, and then you moved back to the Twin Cities. I am in a somewhat similar position, only Washington, D.C. plays the role of the Twin Cities in that respect. Born in the D.C. area, moved to New York, then moved back to D.C. I'm interested in your perspective. What do you see as a vet of local TV as the biggest difference between the local TV world of New York, like the capital of American media, and the local TV world of Minneapolis, St. Paul?
I think, I spent 12 years in New York City, so it was a long run, and I was at local news there. I think it's the first time I can kind of see people. Like I can hear and I see my people here. I know they're watching. You know, I don't want to get into ratings, but the ratings are there. People here really care about their news and they hold the bar high for us. And not that New York, they weren't watching, they definitely were, but there's just so much media. You fight for their attention and it's tough to get it. And here I really feel like I have this invested following that holds me accountable. And then also that they're emailing me, they're tweeting me, they're calling me, and they're definitely making sure my reporters and my team know what's going on and that so we don't miss anything. So I see the people.
You very politely avoided a slam on New York City. I'm going to go all the way there and slam it. I do think that one important difference between a place like New York City or even Washington, D.C., honestly, Boston, maybe San Francisco, is that a lot of these large, dense coastal cities are places where young people in their 20s come in for a brief period of time, establish their careers, and then they leave. This isn't to say, of course, that there aren't people who live in these cities for decades and decades and decades. Of course there are. But a lot of people, I think, treat these cities as career trampolines. And that's one reason why you don't have this investment in the local community. It's just because you don't see this as a place you're going to live for 10 years. And as a result, why would you pay a lot of attention to what's happening right down the street? You pay attention potentially to national news. Andy, for you, tell me about the role that MinnPost plays in an already pretty crowded local news scene in Minneapolis and Minnesota. As Matt, my fellow Thompson, was just saying a few minutes ago, Minnesota is spectacular and unique in terms of the success of its local news. How does MinnPost see a niche where it can be successful here?
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is in the 12 years that MinnPost has been around, we've seen decline of employment in the U.S. newspaper industry by about 50%. Right? So even as we have organizations like the Star Tribune doing great work, we still have such a net reduction in capacity. And it could be argued that even in its heyday, there are a lot of topics that are really important and vital to the conversation that aren't covered all that well. And so, as we think about it, we just have that laser beam niche on how is it that we're going to serve engaged citizens in making the decisions that they have to every day about whether, when, and how they engage in our civic conversation. And that's what we're here to do. We're not going to ever write a Vikings game story. I'm going to go to the Strip for that.
I'm interested to go to the audience now. Well, first of all, in general, if you have any question about something that we say, you're free to raise your hand. The question that I'm particularly interested in is, we used to do a thing at The Atlantic called media diets, where we'd ask people about what it is they do when they wake up in the morning. What do they read? What do they listen to? What do they watch? And I'm interested in having some people talk about their local news media diet. Tell me what it is that you depend on, that you love in terms of local news and media, that you essentially could not possibly do without. Right behind you.
I retired a few years ago from working at the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and now I've become a news consumer. So I wake up in the morning and I subscribe to both dailies, the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press. And after a while I go online and I usually focus on my emails that come in. And I've noticed as things get kind of crowded, the subject line becomes rather critical to whether I'm going to click on it. And I find I click quite a bit on MinnPost. But I also subscribe to news digests that get put together by various people, which I find an extremely useful way to get a quick absorption, both from left and right, of what's happening.
Can you say more about what it is about the MinnPost subject lines that are so effective at capturing your fleeting attention?
They reflect my interests. I have an extremely
Your
strong...
familiarity?
Say again, please?
No, go ahead.
I have an extremely strong interest in Minnesota politics. And the reporters who cover the Capitol especially have caught my attention with their excellent reporting. And they tend to focus on the issues that grab me. I'm extremely interested in public records. And MinnPost has an extremely solid data journalism crew that pulls together, Greta Call, for example, pulls together some beautiful information that spreads the information perfectly. And so I find myself focusing quite a bit on what MinnPost has to offer.
Right. Tell me your name, sir.
Al Davis.
Al Davis. Al, a point that you brought up that I think is really important is that the media industry is so crowded that sometimes you're making judgments on what you're going to read or consume in a split second. That there are some parts of the information landscape that are just so super abundant, like everyone is covering the same story. Certainly today, there are probably hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the country covering the impeachment trials, and the challenge of finding an original angle into that story is really difficult. There's a flip side to that challenge, I think, which isn't come up with the most original take on the story that everybody is covering, but rather just cover the story that nobody is covering. Dee, how do you and the Washington Center for Investigative Journalism or investigative reporting think about finding the right story, finding that uncovered territory where you're not just one of 1,000, but you're one of one?
Right, so that's like the media scrum where everybody's covering impeachment or everyone's covering this scandal, and we try to be where that scrum is not. And we do that not because we're special, although we are, but because that's being covered. So our goal is to increase the quality, quantity, and understanding of investigative journalism in Wisconsin. And so if somebody else is doing a great job of investigating something, we cheer them on. If we get tips, we hand them to them. You know, if the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel is leading the pack, we give them our tips, because we don't all need to be writing the same stories. There are literally a million stories out there. So what we try to do is we look at, does it protect the vulnerable, expose wrongdoing, explore solutions. Those are 3 of our guiding values. Then we also look geographically. There are parts, western Wisconsin is a great example, that don't really have a lot of media outlets that cover their issues. That's how we started covering frac sand mining back in 2011. We were getting calls from reporters saying, what is this stuff? What's fracking? What's frac sand? And we're like, we don't know, but I think maybe this is something we should start covering. So that's what we look at. We look at undercovered communities, undercovered regions, and undercovered stories.
Right. Mukhtar, what Dee is talking about essentially is the fact that even in a crowded media environment, you can still succeed if you are smartly specializing in something. Tell me 2 things. First, what you saw was deficient about the way that Minnesota or Minneapolis media was covering the immigrant and refugee population. And second, give me a sense of what you think your readers are most interested in. What are the stories that perform the best?
The first question is, I did a journalism degree at the University of Minnesota and worked at, the largest newsrooms in the state. I worked for D. Hall was my former boss at the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. And, though I am a practicing journalist, I'm also a news consumer. I read stories with a critical eye. And throughout my time, I really found out that stories about immigrants and refugees are written about in a very superficial way, that is not really authentic, that's not very comprehensive, and that's not true to how people live their lives. So I quit my job at the Star Tribune and launched this new nonprofit that I thought will do a better job in terms of keeping the stories of all these communities on the front page every day. And we are seeing, a lot of appetite for this kind of coverage and a lot of hunger in the community. And we are just, filling a gap that hasn't been there. And we are seeing the reactions from our communities. I get a lot of calls, people giving us tips that we can't even keep up with what we are doing. I don't have full-time staff, but we just published 2 stories, and we're seeing a lot of hunger for what we're doing. But based on my experience working at traditional newsrooms, really inspired me to launch this and kind of bridge the gap that I have been seeing. And the stories about immigrants are really, we don't have any competition. We are really writing stories that are out there, that are open. And it's just a matter of reporters going to these communities, establishing trust and deep connections, and they will find really good stories, but that's not happening right now at the moment in the state.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're talking about the gap, because journalists and media companies now have such extraordinary technology for measuring the success of stories that they publish. What we do not have is technology for measuring the potential success of stories that we don't publish. We cannot measure the gap. So I again want to turn to the audience, and I want you to give us a little bit of help here about the gaps that you see in coverage of the city, the state, or the country. You know, if news is in the business of filling all the gaps as you have done, where are the gaps that you see?
Hi, I'm Anastasia. I'm the Executive Director for Common Cause Minnesota. So I first of all appreciate the trust relationships that I know I appreciate. On Twitter, it's one of the first things I do is follow a bunch of the reporters. But to your question, I think there's another layer to media, and that's grassroots ethnic media, which is something the gentleman, I think, was sort of broaching on when we talk about these gaps, right? As Common Cause, we find ourselves oftentimes being the bridge between policy and those that are impacted disparately or lifted unfairly by the power brokers, right? The arenas at the Capitol. Our experience has been a very frustrating one in that you have mainstream media that oftentimes superficially or viscerally reacts to a political situation or a political policy and doesn't delve into some of the meatier substances that a lot of our communities, whether they're communities of color or not, need to be able to engage within that space of democracy in an empowered manner. So I do appreciate the work that each of you are doing, and that would be my input on this disparity is, and even now, where are the grassroots ethnic medias being represented in the forum, with the exception of the gentleman?
Great. Who else? I am open to the possibility that Minneapolis media is perfect. However, I think it's also possible that there still are gaps, or at least ways of covering the news or sports or arts, anything that might make you more likely to watch, read, and subscribe.
Hi, I'm Ruth Thompson. I teach journalism at Southwest Minnesota State University, way down in Marshall, where nobody lives. And we have 12,000 people. We have a very small newspaper. I think they have 5 reporters, 6 reporters, and one of my students actually works for the paper. Sabrina, wave your hand. Come on.
Sabrina's over here. She doesn't want you to know, but she's over here. I just did some reporting.
Yeah. But what I think is really missing in the coverage is anything to do with the rural, as they sometimes say, greater Minnesota, outstate Minnesota. And you gave the example of the Washington Post reporter coming down to Worthington and covering this incredible bus driver who didn't want to drive around the kids, you know, the refugee kids. So I'm wondering how you can do that. It's a long way out there and there's not a lot happening. And as a professor teaching journalism, I have sort of as service work written some stories for the local paper about like DACA recipients and stuff. The backlash is harsh. It's very harsh. So, you know, if you guys came down, then you could leave.
So one thing I could mention, one way that we are able to do some stories is through collaboration, and that's a change that we have seen in the news business. We collaborate with large news outlets, small ones, in big ways and small ways, because we can't do it alone. There are just, I think, 6 full-time people on our staff. We're bringing a 7th one on next week. But so we collaborate with all kinds of news organizations, and I think we're feeling a sense of like, I don't know if it's camaraderie or panic, maybe it's both, that we can't do it alone, and there are fewer reporters, and so we really need to leverage our talents and our information and our expertise with other news outlets that have other expertise to bring you the best stories we can. So we're not at each other's throat, 10 of us all covering the same story, trying to get that little edge on one story, but a lot of us coming together to tell stories.
That's great. Before we turn back to the panel for the end of the session, I do want one more testimonial about gaps. We'll go right over here.
Hi, my name is David, and I just retired from the Minnesota Humanities Center at the end of last year. But here's a gap that I feel quite strongly. I've worked a lot in the arts and cultural community, and a lot of the coverage of the arts and cultural community is still on these sort of, that was an interesting event, here's a great show, go see this gallery. The fact is that the arts economy in Minnesota is one of the largest economies. It's revitalizing urban areas, rural areas, small towns. It is an incredibly important part of the future of Minnesota. and to speak to, the gap in terms of the incredibly diversifying culture of the state. There are authors, playwrights, image makers, movie makers, music makers from multiple cultures. That coverage is very poor, or I should say thin right now. It's a vital part of the state. We're not paying enough attention to it. It's also very hopeful and very productive.
That's a really, really smart idea. Mukhtar, I wonder, is this an interest of yours in covering the immigrant and refugee community, not only covering, we mentioned sort of the policy side of it, the demographic side of it, both really important. Do you also find that there's a strong readership, strong interest in the arts and culture aspects of these communities as well?
Yes, I think, there's a big interest in that. And these are communities that have different cultures and beliefs and all that. And every community has its own culture and interests. So we are, covering arts and culture, business, health, and all the topics that we think will create a well-informed community. So we want to inform these immigrant communities about issues that are happening in their midst, and whether that's politics-wise or culture-wise or economic-wise. We just did a story a couple of weeks ago analyzing the demographics there in the state. And we found out that, some of the largest immigrant groups in Minnesota are actually deepening their roots in the state. These are not newcomers. They are, first generation, second generation immigrants are really establishing, businesses and creating their own companies and playing a big role in the state politics or local politics. So we did a story about that, analyzing and making sure that, these are really communities that are here, and we should inform them and tell these stories in a more authentic way.
And also, I was going to say, general interest newspapers, as they've gotten smaller and smaller, they keep having to make choices. Which beats do they keep? Arts and culture beats, environmental beats, even covering some local governments. A lot of those have fallen by the wayside as the news staffs have gotten smaller. So it's, in some cases, you've had these niche publications sort of come in and fill in the gap. But the truth is there are just fewer people out there, and these beats are the ones that have been on the chopping block.
Right. Last question. Everyone up here represents a different aspect of the future of local news. We have nonprofit policy specialization. We have an investigative reporting team. We have a digital website focused on breaking demographic changes locally and in the state. Carrie, local news is typically thought of as an older form of media, but you guys are starting to look at new streaming opportunities to get your media in front of younger audiences. Just tell me a little bit about that initiative.
Yeah, definitely. It's crazy to talk about growth, right? Like, I hired 5 people in the past 3 weeks, and that's great. And it means that CCO is going to be across more platforms. So we're already doing TV, we're already doing .com, we're doing social platforms, but we're a couple weeks away from launching CBSN Minnesota. So it'll be the first local news that will be an interactive streaming network for us. And so, our hope is that we're a legacy station that has a strong following, but we're going to get the next generation. I tell my people who, are like, oh, more work. I said, now I want to get the daughter and the granddaughter. We already got grandma and mom. So the goal is that we'll get the next generation. We'll have them continue to consume news and be aware and have fun doing it.
A lovely rallying cry. Let's get the next generation. Thank you, everyone on this panel, and thank all of you.
Thank you so much to Derek and Matt, both of the Thompsons, for guiding us through this evening's conversation. As I promised from the outset, we were going to take a look at the solutions, and I think Dee kind of touched on that in her close. And one of the solutions that we heard from both your questions and your comments throughout this evening was the desire to support local news. And so that is a really, really thrilling trend to see, and I hope that continues. So that is a wrap. Thank you so much for a great evening. One more time, please join me in thanking our underwriter for this evening, Google News Initiative. We are incredibly grateful for their support, but most importantly, we're grateful to you for spending your time with us this evening. We know how precious that is, and so we are grateful for you for spending so much of it with us. We hope you'll stick around for a few more moments to enjoy another cocktail there in the back with us. Our reception is made possible through our collaboration with the Star Tribune Media Company. So again, we're grateful for the collaboration there. One last request, if you'll look at all of your tables, you'll see a little survey. We do hope that you take a moment to fill those out. You'll also receive an email from me with those questions. It's so helpful to get your input and your insights and your collective expertise as we work to improve convenings like this. Thank you again so much for being here. We are delighted to be back in Minneapolis. Enjoy the cocktail reception, and thank you again.